apologize. I think I wasn't unmuted. Did you hear me or not?
We did not.
Okay.
Can hear you now.
Well, good evening. Welcome. I'm Gail Barron. I co-chair CB8's Women and Families Committee with Peggy Price. Our forum this evening is also co-sponsored by CB8's Technology Committee, and we should be joined shortly by its chair, Rebecca Dangor. The topic of our forum is extremely timely. Numerous studies from firms including McKinsey & Company, Accenture, Goldman Sachs have all been asking the same question: how is AI changing the future of work? That's our question, and I'm now going to turn the program over to Peggy Price. Peggy.
Good evening, and thank you for attending this important program. Ever since ChatGPT became a sensation, reports on artificial intelligence have been blanketing the media. We're learning AI can improve lives, but also may replace some of our jobs, or those our children may aspire to. In fact, according to a recent study, jobs traditionally held by women may become the most vulnerable to AI. Tonight, our speakers will tackle such issues. They'll identify the jobs and sectors likely to be affected by AI, and they'll suggest ways to avoid job losses. In addition, we'll hear how well New York City's new Law 144 is likely to prevent discrimination when AI is used in the hiring process. So let's hear from our distinguished speakers. They include Dr. Robert Siemens, a professor at New York University's Stern School of Business and a director of NYU's Stern Center for the Future of Management. Dr. Julia Schor, an economist and professor of sociology at Boston College. Dr. John Hauschneck, professor of Human Resource Studies at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and Dr. Julia Soyanovich, associate professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering and the Center for Data Science. We have a lot to cover, so let's begin now with our first speaker, Dr. Robert Siemens of NYU. Dr. Siemens?
Thank you very much for inviting me to present. I'm just pulling up some slides here. Bear with me one sec. Okay, does that look okay to everybody? Is that showing up on the full screen? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about occupational exposure to AI and some of the research that I've done in this space. But first, I want to motivate things from a little bit of a broader level. So as the co-chair Price just mentioned a moment ago, there are lots of ways in which AI is entering our everyday lives. Lots of ways in which it's quite exciting, and I've listed a few things here from if you will, sort of the mundane to the potential, right? Autonomous vehicles are maybe potential at some point, to the useful, things like Google Maps, which I'm a big fan of, to the life-saving and also life-changing, again, as co-chair Price mentioned a moment ago. But, one of the big worries that lots of folks have is what the effect of all of this is going to be on jobs. So let me say at the outset, I'm not very worried about the effect of AI on jobs. I think many jobs will change. I don't think that many jobs will be lost as a result of AI. So I just wanted to get that out there at the start. Nevertheless, this is a big worry, and it's something that lots of folks do worry about. So we've seen really rapid breakthroughs in terms of what AI can do in a lab setting. And so I'll just give you one example of this by focusing over here on this chart on the left. So this is ImageNet, which is one of the ways that traditionally folks have measured how well computers, by computers I mean artificial intelligence, can do at image recognition. The x-axis is time, okay, so we can see how it has done over time. The y-axis is error rate, so the lower you come on that, the better the algorithm is doing at this specific metric, ImageNet image recognition, and you see some dramatic improvement over time. Computers can now figure out, can do image recognition better than humans can, which is this dotted line here. So we've seen dramatic breakthroughs in laboratory settings. And then we've seen also that it's now made its way from laboratory settings to commercial applications. And there are a variety of ways that we can track that. We just see it in the news, right? We heard about ChatGPT a moment ago, but you could also look at other things like investment, venture capital investment in AI startups, and you've seen a dramatic increase there. You could look at patent applications for things that have to do with AI-related technologies. You see a dramatic increase there. So again, we see breakthroughs in the lab, and then it looks like a lot of people see commercial opportunities there. As an economist, I tend to get excited when we see these new technologies get commercialized. Why? Well, there's lots of evidence that productivity growth, if you will, sort of economic growth, while we're still growing, we're growing at a slower rate. We is not just the United States, but many of the OECD countries that you could look at, and that's what this chart here is showing. And I apologize, I know I'm moving sort of quickly through some of these things, but that's intentional just to sort of lay a little bit of groundwork. So again, the story here is we have economic growth, but we're growing at a slowing rate. And so the hope is that AI and robots, let's say, and other newer technologies could help boost this economic growth, just like other new technologies have done in the past, like steam engines, electricity, early computers, the internet. So in principle, AI will also boost innovation and economic growth, just like these other ones have in the past. But again, the question is still, well, what about jobs? What will happen with the jobs? And so one of the things that I've done is worked with a couple of co-authors. One is named Ed Felton. He's a computer scientist at Princeton. And the other is Manav Raj. He's a professor. He was a PhD student of mine at NYU, and he's now a professor at University of Pennsylvania. And we have a series of projects where we came up with a methodology to link advances in AI along 10 different dimensions to 52 different human abilities and skills. And then from these abilities and skills, we can then go to the occupation level, and happy to go into more detail about sort of all the machinations, if you will, in terms of how we do that. But in any case, we've come up with this methodology, and then we've used this methodology to try to identify the occupations that are more or less exposed to advances in AI. Two of the applications that we have focused in on are language modeling and image recognition. So again, a moment ago, you heard about ChatGPT. So that would be an example of a large language model. And so there's been some dramatic advances in terms of what AI can do when it comes to language modeling. So with this methodology, what we've done is tried to identify the occupations that are more or less exposed to advances in language modeling, as well as image generation, which is another generative AI area where we've seen a lot of advances recently. So what you're seeing here are the list of the top 20 most exposed occupations to advances in language modeling and advances in image generation, at least according to our methodology. These are the occupations, and now I'm just going to move forward a slide. These are the industries that are most exposed. So I'm going to come back to the occupations, and I just want to highlight a couple things. We were a little bit surprised when we first did this. Why? Well, we are college professors ourselves. And if you look at the top 20 occupations that are most exposed to advances in language modeling, I think it's 17 of them you see teachers, post-secondary. So these are college professors, basically. So English language college professors, history college professors, philosophy professors, et cetera. We thought about it a little bit, and in a way it wasn't very surprising, right? I mean, what is it that we spend a lot of our time doing? We are ingesting a lot of text, reading a lot of text, processing it to a certain extent, spending a lot of time creating content based on that text, and that content could either be for delivery for our students, or it could be for delivery maybe at academic conferences or something like that. And so in a way, it wasn't really a surprise when you think about it, what these language modelers can do, that actually that our occupation is very exposed to this. Now, what does exposure mean, though? We intentionally use this term exposure instead of threat of substitute or opportunity for augmentation or something like that. because we don't quite know how the new technology will actually affect any given occupation. I think, at least for my job, in most instances, it's going to be very, it'll be sort of an augmenting type of a technology as opposed to a substitutive type of technology. Focusing on image generation over here, I sort of want to highlight two things. So there's sort of two different categories of occupations here. One category would be occupations that spend a lot of, that sort of create content, sort of image related content. And then the other would be occupations that rely a lot on three-dimensional visualization. So in the former category, you might have things like film and video editors, maybe interior designers, architects, et cetera. You know, people that spend a lot of time sort of creating things that are image related. And then in that second category of things like chemical engineers or civil engineers, and sorry, architects would probably fall into that second category as well, where it's really important to sort of be able to visualize things in three-dimensional space. Air traffic controllers would be probably a very tangible example of that, right? Sort of trying to imagine or visualize where planes are in some sort of three-dimensional space. And so again, what our methodology is telling us is that it's these types of occupations that are more exposed to advances in image generation. And so I think there maybe it's a little clearer that it doesn't mean that those jobs are going to be substituted. You know, if anything, you could imagine very useful tools being created from this new technology that help folks like air traffic controllers or that help chemical engineers and things like that. Okay, so this was sort of the first step. And then what we did is we took all these occupations and we linked them to some statistical data around different demographic outcomes. So things like salary, education, et cetera. So this will just be the last minute. I'll just sort of very quickly walk you through a few of these figures that I find interesting. So here's the way to read this. Along the x-axis, we have occupations. And by the way, this is taking 800 occupations, but then putting them into 20 different buckets. It just makes it a little bit easier to see what we're looking at here. So what we have here is occupations that tend to have a higher median salary. So if you see my cursor, I'm up here, you know, 100,000 or more. It's those occupations that are more exposed, if you look over here on the y-axis, more exposed to advances in generative AI. Okay, so higher salary, more exposed. Here's education. So occupations that tend to require more education tend to be more exposed. Here's creative ability used in a job. So jobs that require more creativity, okay, those are jobs that are more exposed to advances in AI. Now I'm going to show you some more sort of traditional, if you will, demographic characteristics. So this is looking at men. Occupations that tend to have more men are less exposed. And so now you know what's next. Occupations that have more women are more exposed. Here's white. Occupations that tend to have more white individuals, tend to employ more white individuals, are more exposed. Here's black. Occupations that tend to employ more black individuals are less exposed. Asian, more exposed. Hispanic, less exposed. Okay. So I think a lot of what we're just trying to do here is just characterize some of the differences across occupations and the idea that the advances that we are seeing right now in this technology are going to be affecting lots of different people, but the effects are going to vary a lot depending on the different occupations that people are in. And I think what I'll do is I'll stop there. But happy, of course, let me stop sharing. Happy, of course, to go into more detail for anyone who's interested.
Thank you very much. We'd next like to hear from Dr. Juliet Shore, an economist and professor of sociology at Boston College. And by the way, I see that sociology is on the a tricky list. So maybe Dr. Shore would also like to comment on that. But thank you. And go ahead, Dr. Shore.
Well, yeah, my first thought was to say I obviously made a mistake moving from a department of economics into a sociology department. Thank you for Professor Siemens for alerting me to this, and I need to, rethink. So thanks. That was a great presentation, and now I want to sort of go in a slightly different direction to talk about how we might respond to the challenging parts of AI. And I'm just going to focus on one part of this, which is working time. So Professor Siemens just talked about the impact of AI on jobs and unemployment. And of course, there's a lot out there, people giving a range of different points of view about both what's, which industries and occupations will be most affected, as well as the question of unemployment. And I would just say that, most economists take the point of view that Professor Siemens did, which is we don't really have to worry too much about unemployment. What's going to happen is the nature of jobs is going to change. Some people will be helped, hurt, etc. But that in the aggregate, the economy will generate sufficient numbers of jobs. And I think one of the reasons, of course, we don't know what the future is, but one reason that I think economists are so sanguine about this has to do with past experience. And particularly what's happened since the Industrial Revolution. We've had a tremendous amount of labor-saving technical change. I want to highlight two features of our economy in that past period that I think are really relevant to thinking about the future. And I'll just say out front, I don't know what the impact of AI is going to be on unemployment and employment rates. But two things about the past that I think sometimes the standard debate misses. One is rapid growth. So we were in an economy which grew very rapidly, and there are lots of reasons to think that mature economies like our own will no longer grow so rapidly. And there's a debate about that in the profession and whether we're in for a period of much lower growth. But the other piece of it that I think is really key is time reduction, because the labor-saving technical change, and that's what AI is, it's labor-saving technical change that occurred from the Industrial Revolution through into the post-war era, was accompanied by rapid, sustained reductions in average hours of work, and also in over the lifetimes. So people have come to work a shorter fraction of their lifetimes. Now, in the US, that sort of progress of work time reduction kind of stalled out to a large extent. My analyses show that sort of beginning at the end of the 1960s, and we can debate about exactly what's happened to average hours of work since then. European countries have continued to reduce working hours, and there's been a big divergence. But I do think that, so why am I mentioning this? As I said, I'm not here to predict what's going to happen. In fact, I want to give a much more normative talk tonight. But my point is that if the United States economy is no longer in a process of continual work time reduction, as it was for most of that period, 150 years after the Industrial Revolution, we're facing a different world than the one of the past. So on the other hand, I'm feeling rather optimistic about work time reduction. And so whatever the impact of AI, sort of thinking about work time reduction and getting us onto a path of work time reduction will be beneficial for employees, companies, communities, and planet. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. So for the last 2 years plus, I've been studying companies that are giving their employees shorter working hours. They are going to 4-day work weeks. They are keeping pay at the 5-day work week, so no reductions in pay, shifting from 5 to 4. And we've been studying what's happening to these firms. We've had a tremendous amount of publicity. These are just a few of the many stories about our work. And oh, where did it go? Yes, sorry, that one got in the wrong place. I was very pleased to see Benjamin Appelbaum's piece today in the New York Times referencing our work and talking about why it's so important to get down to 32 hours. And of course, the impetus for this is the fact that the United Auto Workers has put a 32-hour work week on the bargaining table in the negotiations that they're currently engaged in. And as people know, the 40-hour work week came into being. A little bit of debate about whether it was 1938 or 1940, but basically 85 years ago. So no reduction in the standard work week since then. And the sort of emergence of a movement to reduce working hours, I think is really interesting finally. So it's been a long time. So I have been involved, I am the lead researcher for trials that have been going on around the world for companies, as I said, giving 4-day weeks to their workers. The first trials began in 2022. The impetus for the trials came from a businessman in New Zealand named Andrew Barnes, who read a magazine article, I think it was Harvard Business Review or something, saying people are wasting a lot of time at work. It was a kind of, anyway, the article said people only work 2 or 3 hours a day. I mean, it was kind of a ridiculous claim, but he thought, well, maybe I could give my workers shorter work time if they got more efficient. And he came up with this idea of the 100-80-100 model, 100% of the pay, 80% of the time at work, but people have to do 100% of the output. And so he started an organization that has been running these trials, and before companies change their schedules, they go through 2 months of work reorganization. So trying to figure out as an organization how to make themselves more efficient, how to re-engineer work to be able to get as much done in the 4 days. Requirements for participating in the trials are just that you maintain pay at 100% and you have a meaningful reduction in hours. Not every organization went down to 32, although the vast majority did. And then eventually there's been a little bit of a fee to help defray costs. So, whoops. All right, so I'm going to just give you some of the results from the US and Canadian organizations that have taken place in the trial. We are just starting a new US-Canada trial. So just a couple of things. One is these tend to be smaller companies, and that's not surprising. I think it mostly has to do with the fact that big companies don't need to engage in a trial like this. They can do their own research, they can bring in their own consultants, and of course, many of them are doing that now. We have a mix of remote and fully remote, not remote and fully remote. About 44% in these trials were fully remote. That's high for the global database that we now have. And the industries do tend to be white collar. Professional services was the biggest in this one. We have a fair number of IT, but we also have, and across our trials, we have construction and manufacturing. We have healthcare organizations. We have restaurants. So the idea that this is just a white collar thing, I think, is not right. Although these are the industries that I think have the easiest time sort of figuring out how to re-engineer the work. So I'll give you a couple of findings, and then I'm probably getting close to my 10 minutes. So the first is the companies have been very, very happy. And that's not a surprise. These are companies who self-selected into these trials. So they're companies who thought this would work for them. On a scale of 1 to 10, they've rated the trials at an 8.7, productivity and performance at a 7.7, ability to attract new employees, 8.7. We see revenue increases over the course of the trial. We see big declines in turnover intentions of employees, which is a big issue for companies today. And among this group of companies, the US and Canadian, none of them, when we surveyed them at 6 months, had said they were planning to return to 5 days. 89% were definitely continuing, 11% were leaning toward. And for our global database, which has maybe close to 200 companies at this point, I would say there are probably 10 that we know of, maybe 15 who have said they're either pausing their trials, and then a smaller, among those, say 10 or 15, there are a few who have definitely said no longer doing it. Others are sort of pausing temporarily. So very, very few companies going back. Employee findings, very strong. Employees rate the trial at a 9.1. 95% prefer this schedule to the 5-day. Big improvements in self-reports of productivity. Over half say they feel more control of their schedules. And we asked them a question that economists, care a lot about, their sort of willingness to pay. So how much would they give up in thinking about their next job? If it were a 5-day week job, how much more salary would they have to earn in order to take the job? And we find really high, quote unquote, willingness to pay for the 4-day week schedule. About 33% say between 26 and 50%. 12% would say they need more than 50%, and almost 14% say no amount of money would induce them to go back to 5 days. Big improvements in health and well-being. We have about 15 different metrics. I'm not going to show them all here, but burnout, a big problem in today's workforce. Almost 70% experienced reductions in burnout. 40% less stress, 59% decline in negative emotions, similar for positive emotions, significant increases in people's self-report of physical and mental health. And this is from a baseline to the end point of our survey. So before the trial starts, and then 6 months after the schedule has been changed. Anxiety falls, fewer sleep problems, more exercise, reductions in fatigue. Increases in life satisfaction, job satisfaction, time satisfaction, reductions in work, family, and work-life conflict in all 4 directions. So big well-being improvements. One other thing I'll say about that, in our models, what we find is that the working hour reductions themselves are driving the well-being improvements, in a way that the larger the work time reduction, the bigger the well-being improvement, as one might expect. And when we do what's called the mediation analysis, which is seeing, okay, so are there other variables that are working through work time that are really driving? So what is it about shorter work time that in itself doesn't seem like it would have much of a direct effect? It does have some, but there are 2 main categories of things which are driving those well-being effects. Some of them I've mentioned here: sleep, exercise, and less fatigue. Those are really key. Those are the sort of outside of the workforce behavioral changes. And then within the workplace, what we're seeing is really big increases in people's sense of their own efficacy, their productivity, their efficiency. We have a work smart scale. People feel they're working much better and smarter in comparison to the past. So that also tends to have a really strong impact through those working hours on their well-being. I had a little line on one of my early slides that said shorter work time is better for companies and communities and employees. And the last thing I said is planet, and that's the last point I want to make. Very, very difficult to get the total environmental impact. We're looking at carbon impacts specifically of this kind of a change. So we just have some little glimmers of evidence, but let me tell you about some of them. And they're all in a pretty positive direction. First of all, we're seeing fewer people commuting by car. They have more time, they're less rushed. They use slower means of transportation, and their commuting time has declined, even though there's more return to office going on over this time. So their days in the office have gone up, but the average commuting time has fallen. There was really no what we call travel rebound, meaning we were worried, well, a lot of these people are getting 3-day weekends. Are they going to fly off to places or drive places and do things that use a lot of energy for transportation? And we didn't see that. And then we also asked them, again, baseline and endpoint, if they did more environmentally friendly activities during the trial, and 42, such as walking and cycling rather than driving, and 42% do increase on that metric. Last thing I'll say is that we have repeated a subset of these questions at 12 months. Just to make sure, well, it wasn't just the novelty of the schedule. We got all these great results, but maybe they fall back after a few months. And there's almost no change at 6 months after the end of the trial. So 12 months from when the new schedule started, there's some very small differences. The one thing that falls back a little bit is job satisfaction. I think people do get a little bit used to it, but on all the other well-being metrics and that I've shown you, and most of the other workplace metrics that I've shown you, they're pretty stable. So my final point is to say, I think that if we want AI to be a positive thing, one of the things we really need to think about is how its introduction into the workplace can help us to reduce working hours and give people better lives. And that is one of the things that we're starting to hear a lot from the companies about the ways in which shorter work time and AI are really coming together in their practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I don't mean to jumpstart the Q&A, but there is an issue that I'd like you to quickly comment before we move on, is that there's been some discussion among people that those who choose to work from home as opposed to going back 5 days a week may be most vulnerable to losing their job due to AI. Professor Shore, what do you think about that? Is that something that's come up?
It hasn't in ours. I think Professor Siemens might be in a better spot to answer that than me. I don't know. They may be in a more vulnerable position to be laid off if their employers want them back and they don't want to go. But that really is not an AI thing. That's more about just workplace, worker employer dynamics, I think. But I have no idea. I don't. Professor Siemens, do you have a thought about
so my answer would be the same as Professor Shore's, both in that I don't know, but I would suspect it has less to do with specifics of the occupation, let's say, and more to do with the employer and just different decisions that they're making. But I haven't seen anything systematic on this.
Thanks. Anyway, we'll move on, and we'd like to now hear from Dr. John Hoshnick. He's a professor of human resource studies at Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. I think Dr. Hoshnick is going to focus on, well, perhaps several things, but one thing is New York City's new local law 144 that is addressing the issue of whether AI in hiring is going to prevent or not prevent discrimination in hiring. So, Professor Hoshnick, could you discuss that a little bit, and anything else that you'd like to add about your perspective about AI and employment?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me, and a great panel. Thanks for letting me be part of it. So as you mentioned, I'm a faculty member at Cornell in the Human Resource Studies Department. So that's my focus area, is really thinking about this from an HR standpoint and what employers do as they're thinking about the high volume hiring and employee development and retention issues that they deal with on a regular basis. I teach courses in staffing and HR analytics. So this intersection of data and hiring is kind of, close to my interest areas. And I'll talk about the hiring law in a second, but I just wanted to share a few examples maybe to add to what we've heard already around where AI is coming into the workplace that folks may not be familiar with. And I'll stick pretty close to the HR space. That's what I hear most about. And I've kind of ordered these from least controversial to maybe most. And so I'll end with the hiring sphere, because I think that's the one that maybe makes a lot of folks most uneasy. But one area that we're seeing AI used within the HR space is cutting out a lot of the transactional work of HR. So if you look historically at the profession and what they would do as part of their roles for companies, is helping employees with a lot of administrative tasks, right? I have to change my address, I'm enrolling in this new benefits program, whatever it might be. And we're seeing a lot of companies automate those activities. One company in particular, IBM, has created this interactive chat bot that's all AI driven, that you can ask questions in sort of natural language. I'd like to change my address, or I've moved, or I now, I worked in New York State, now I'm in Illinois, what do I need to do? And some of these questions are so routine and they've been asked hundreds or thousands of times that they can automate a lot of that activity. And so that's something that you're seeing a lot more of, is trying to cut out some of the repetitive kind of generally lower skill work that HR folks are doing and automating it. And so that's one kind of development that I think that we've seen. And, from what I've heard anecdotally, at least, it's a welcome advance. Folks didn't like doing that kind of work. It was more mundane. They'd rather be doing some of the more interactive work with employees, coaching them, trying to help with their development and so forth. So that's one development. The second area that we've seen a lot more work going in with AI is around employee development and career planning. So if you think about, 5, 10, even, maybe clearly 20 years ago, the way people would advance within companies is basically trying to talk to folks and figure out what's next, right? Talk to your manager, maybe talk to HR, and figure out what your next career move is. Especially for large companies that have the resources, what you're seeing now is more AI-enabled systems and tools that are self-service for employees. So an example might be, I'm, 3 years out of school, I'm working in finance, I've been enjoying my job up to this point, but I might want to move somewhere else, or maybe try a different role that's adjacent to my current skills. So some of these tools now, you can kind of ask it questions, interact with the system. Again, IBM's done some of this work that I'm most familiar with, and it'll return profiles of potential career paths that you might be interested in. And so I think there, again, it's opening up a wider range of opportunities to plan their own careers, understand what options are out there. And they're built on historical information and patterns of employee mobility and movement that have occurred in the past. So, that's potentially a positive development. It cuts out some of the differential access that certain employees might have through their own personal networks, and gives them kind of a wider array of options, and would also give them, you're interested in this career, here's what you might need in terms of background or skills to be advanced into that role. So that's the second area. I think the third one you've probably seen a lot of headlines on is around trying to understand and manage employee attrition or turnover risk. So a lot of companies, again, are developing models and tools that are trying to forecast when employees are likely to leave. So we know that's costly and disruptive for a lot of firms, and the tools are being developed to try to model that turnover likelihood based on a variety of factors, right? The external labor markets, internal factors, maybe you have survey data or engagement scores on employees, and companies are using that to try to forecast attrition risk. So that one maybe is starting to border into questions that you may have. And I think the final one is where you've seen a lot of the controversy, and now the New York City law, and that's around hiring. And so within the hiring space, what you're seeing are companies trying to think about, how do we automate the screening of candidates for open positions. I saw in the comment section for the New York City law, NYU, the hospital system at NYU had some 350,000 applicants for, I think it was about 15,000 positions. So how do you get through that volume of applicants in a careful and systematic way, giving people an opportunity to show their skills, but in a way that you can do it quickly and efficiently, right? I think the person from NYU wrote, given our urgency of care and our needs for these open positions, we don't have time or the luxury to wait weeks and weeks to fill these open slots. So I think there's a lot more questions and a lot more controversy because of demonstrated bias in the past, but then the tools, as Professor Siemens mentioned, tools are improving and they're becoming more reliable, more accurate, more human-like in some ways in terms of evaluating, say, recorded interviews and things like that. But it does open up all sorts of ethical and clearly legal questions about whether this is appropriate. So we can talk more about the AI and hiring law, but essentially what the impetus was for it and is to try to make transparent what companies are doing in this space. So historically, companies could kind of do what they wanted, and we wouldn't know as candidates that our application was fed through a system to screen for certain keywords. We may get a callback, we may not. So the law is meant to try to open up some transparency about what tools are being used. And then I think beyond that, trying to identify whether those practices have potential discriminatory impact. And so again, historically, we haven't required companies to report the data, but that's now part of this law, is to report how many applicants you had, what percent were screened using certain tools, what percent passed, and by race and sex. So that is a new development for sure. As I've followed the law, and we can talk about this, it's gone through many iterations, lots of questions, it gets very technical. And as you're seeing on our panel, very diverse set of folks with backgrounds in everything from, more of the AI machine learning sphere to HR, to psychology, to other areas where people have a lot of history and research on some of these points. So I think definitely more to be learned, but it is an interesting development in terms of regulation for some of these tools that are coming out. So with that, I'll pause and turn it over to Julia.
Well, let me just,
Sure.
before we go on to Dr. Stoyanovich, I think you have spoken out that you don't feel that local law 144 goes far enough. Is that accurate? And if so, why not?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I understand why. It's too early, in my view, to have a comprehensive law that addresses all of the unknowns we have. These tools have yet, I'm just starting to see research that talks about the validity or the adverse impact of some of these tools in the hiring sphere. We know kind of historically how these tools have fared when it's a human sort of scoring and making decisions, but this is new territory. And so I felt like the legislation is fairly limited at this point in terms of its scope and what it covers. Some of the language suggests that there's a lot of things that don't count as an automated employment decision tool, as they call them. And so I don't think a lot of companies are too worried about it in terms of it restricting their capabilities. So I don't think it goes far, but I also don't think it's the time yet to go too far with it because of many of the unknown questions that remain with it. But good
Thank
question.
you very much. And finally, we have Dr. Julia Stoyanovich, the Associate Professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering and the Center for Data Science. Dr. Stoyanovich, you're on.
All right. So let me speak a bit about responsible AI and how it pertains to hiring and employment specifically. And in addition to my academic titles as associate professor, I also direct a center at NYU called the Center for Responsible AI. And our goal at the center is to make responsible AI synonymous with AI, because we don't want to be in a situation where there are two kinds of technologies, one that is being used responsibly in ways that are socially sustainable, and another that is just there to make money for somebody and make things worse for somebody else. Specifically, I was actually asked also to speak about Local 144. I've been one of the people who has been following the law from from the time when it was first proposed, and have been testifying at every hearing, and have also been writing quite a bit about this. So I have very strong opinions on the law. And here I'm giving you a snapshot of the text of the law as it was passed in December 21. And as John said, the law has gone through multiple iterations. It has been changed. Its scope has been limited in some respects, but then in other respects, it has been made more concrete through rulemaking. And I will return to this. I want to highlight here that there are essentially two sets of provisions in the law. The first is that whenever an automated decision tool is being used as part of screening of candidates, and also as part of sourcing, honestly, although this is not being interpreted in that way today, a bias audit needs to be conducted before this tool can be put into use. And the second set of provisions that I personally am much more excited about are here highlighted in hot pink, and they refer to public disclosure, that people need to be notified even before they apply, that they will be subjected to an AI as part of the screening. And then also the original law had this phrase here that they should be notified about the specific job qualifications and characteristics that will be used by the tool. And this unfortunately has been de-emphasized in the version of the law that is now the rules that the city is following. So stepping back for just a second, I want to speak about responsible AI and to take that lens when we think about the use of AI in hiring and employment. So on this slide, I'm doing my best to distill some of the hallmarks of the responsible use of AI. And I'm doing this through examples. So here you see 3 examples: Roomba, the smart vacuum at the bottom right, a chess playing AI at the bottom left, and then there is a smart home device, a smart light. And so these tools work, and we can check that they work. Each one of them responds to a clear need for improvement. So for example, Roomba is gonna clean your room without you being involved. We can check that the tool has worked. So in the case of Roomba, we can check whether or not it left the room clean when it finished its work. And we are capable currently, in terms of our data and software and hardware, to be able to build a tool like Roomba, the smart vacuum. And similarly, for the other examples that I'm giving here, game playing systems like the chess playing AI, we can check again that it works because it beats somebody like Garry Kasparov at his game, right? And with a smart light, we can also validate if it works. We can check whether it turns on the light at the times when we would have turned it on and turns it off when we would have turned it off. There is another very important component to thinking about the responsible use of AI, and this is decision maker readiness. So for this, I like to give an example of the use of AI in medical imaging, where we have different types of tools that essentially augment human capabilities. They help clinicians, for example, diagnose diseases with the help of semi-synthetic magnetic resonance imaging scans, or they help clinicians diagnose just essentially by suggesting what can be seen in an image, in a medical image. But what's important here is that we never are relying on an AI to come up with a diagnosis, and then that becomes the official diagnosis for the patient. This is always used as a decision support device. And the clinician ultimately has the final say as to whether they challenge the prediction that an AI made, or if they agree with that prediction. And here the clinician is gonna be somebody who's trained in medical ethics. They understand that it's their career that's on the line, and they take responsibility for these decisions. Now let's look at AI in hiring and employment. So here the promise is that by using AI to help screen candidates, we are going to make the process more efficient for employers. And this is what John underscored when he spoke about the NYU Langone example. We will make things more efficient for job seekers as well, matching them with jobs and then allowing them to apply for multiple positions with a click of a button. And then there's also this belief that the use of AI may help us with improving workforce diversity. And this is based on this realization that humans are really, really bad at hiring because they like to hire people consciously or subconsciously who are like them and who match the company culture. And then for that reason, we end up hiring the same types of people that we have been hiring in the past. But unfortunately, we have been seeing time and again, and I'm giving here a couple of press mentions of this issue, that the use of AI in hiring does not make things better when it comes to improving workforce diversity. And I'm happy to dwell on any of these examples if there is time for Q&A. So we are not convinced, in fact, that this last component here, that this improved workforce diversity as an opportunity is in fact something that AI is helping us with. And this is why bias auditing is part of Local Law 144. And together with co-authors, I spoke about the need for bias auditing and for actually a need to audit for bias according to a much broader set of characteristics than what the current law includes. And this is an op-ed in the New York Times that we published leading up to the passing of this law. Another component of the law, as I mentioned already, is that we need to disclose to job seekers more about the hiring process. First of all, we need to tell them that an AI is going to be used to screen them. We also need to tell them what data about them this system is going to use. And ideally, we would also want to tell them how this data was used. So what specific features of their application made it so that they were deemed qualified or unqualified for the position. And I wrote about this in a Wall Street Journal article where I'm advocating for nutritional labels, so to say. So these are sort of consumer-facing transparency devices that I think we should attach to job ads that are going to tell people before they apply what qualifications are required, which data about them the system will use to screen them, how they will be assessed specifically, and whether or not they have an opportunity to request an alternative screening, to ask that a human screens them instead, or to say that a particular screening may be discriminatory in their case, for example, because of a disability. Right. So an additional component here, and this is something that Local Law 144 lacks, is that there is no opportunity really explicitly for us to look at whether the tools are working well at all. So there is no conversation in this law about validity. And this is something that we also mentioned in our New York Times article, giving an example of a particular tool that a company by the name of Pymetrics produces that claims to assist employers in assessing people's soft skills by making them play games that anybody who would kind of interact with the tool and read this would have a hunch that they have nothing to do with the individual's qualifications for the job. So one of these games is you're blowing up balloons and you need to blow them up as large as possible without the balloons going poof, right? So how relevant is that to a particular position for which you're being screened? So in my own work, together with colleagues, we have interrogated a couple of tools that are used very broadly and that cost a lot of money, that lots of employers use, that claim to construct a personality profile of a job applicant based on their resume or their LinkedIn profile or their Twitter feed. And I don't have time to describe this in detail, but what we found was essentially that if you give a resume to one of these tools in PDF file format, and then you give the very same resume in a different file format that the tool also accepts, and in fact, the tool doesn't tell you, please, I prefer PDF or I prefer text, you very often end up with a different, substantially different personality profile being produced by this tool. And we did all kinds of other stability or sensitivity analyses of a couple of tools here. They're produced by companies called Crystal and Humantic AI. And we found that they essentially cannot be used as valid instruments for pre-hire assessment, simply because they disagree with their own predictions when they should agree, when nothing changes materially about the input. So this is something that we should worry about as people, as job seekers, as members of the public, that lots of these tools that are being bought and sold are essentially snake oil, right? They don't work in any meaningful sense of the word. And I think that we need legal protections to make sure that these tools don't proliferate. I pasted a link in chat to a comic book series where I discuss this and other issues and speak more generally about what is AI and why we as people should care about it. Please take a look at the comics. They are available in English as well as in Spanish. And you can read there some of our opinions also about specifically bias in hiring and other aspects of this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Gail, go ahead.
Each one of you was just so stellar. You know, I've learned so much this evening. We really appreciate your joining us. But now I'd like to open our forum up to question and answers and find out what some of our participants might have questions about. Does anyone have a question?
I
People
do.
are, okay, Lori.
It's Alita. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but there seemed to be an inconsistency in something that Mr., and I'm terrible at names, Housknick had mentioned, which is on the one hand, employees would like opportunities to be, or HR people would like opportunities to help guide employees into alternative or stronger career paths. And on the other hand, I thought he also said that AI would take over the job of giving employees options and information on career paths. And that seemed inconsistent. And to me, therein lies a huge problem, which is, and I don't really know that much about AI. I know some of the copyright issues and some of my real concerns about jobs. And I guess someone else had raised the issue that men are less affected than women, while at the same time, jobs that had been typically populated by men, such as professorships and the legal profession, the medical profession, white collar jobs, those kinds of jobs are more affected, but men are less affected, unless you're looking at men as also laborers and factory workers and the less skilled kinds of jobs. So I wasn't sure about that. But the idea that people write cover letters if they don't fit neatly into a box in order to be evaluated by somebody in looking for a job. And while they may not have the skills that directly match up with everything on the wish list for the employer, they have something else to offer. And if AI is not looking or able to understand there's something else to offer, then it seems that society is going to lose something in the form of, it's not necessarily creativity, but it's the possibility of having someone better, someone broader, more diversity in thought in a position. And how do you check for that? How do you know what's going on? And you don't know that people interviewers are going to be able to see that, but maybe they can, because they're not being programmed. And so I don't know how any of this works. And if I'm just garbled, please forgive me, but I just am very concerned about an oncoming homogeneity of a workforce and jobs, as well as the loss of jobs. You can't take someone who sweeps floors for a living and make them a computer programmer necessarily that easily. And that's what, and that's something else too, I guess. So you don't really have to answer any of those. Those are just concerns. So I thank you. And I should have said so right from the beginning, that this was such an educational, informative, fascinating program that just seems to get on this. There are just so many issues. So I'll stop here. Thank you so very much, Peggy and Gail, for organizing this, and for all of the panelists for bringing such strong insight and information to us all. Thank you.
Before we move on, though, is there any of our speakers who want to address any of the points that Alita raised?
Maybe I
Okay.
was
But I could, and I also apologize. I'm going to need to leave in just a few minutes. So one thing that I would say is that unless somebody shows to us that an AI works, and I wasn't explicit in this, right? But I mentioned that, you know, an ability to check whether a thing works is a requirement for us to claim that AI is being used responsibly. Unless the vendor can show to us that the thing works, we should not take that on faith. And from what I've seen so far, I'm really not at all convinced that the vast majority of the tools being marketed today for hiring, but also in other domains like ChatGPT, that they work, as in like producing accurate information and doing something that is better than a random coin flip. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Just a quick note.
Sure.
I would add to Julia's comment that I'm more skeptical on the hiring side because of the lack of validity and data there. On the development side, I think it's a good thing to give more opportunities to more people. In the research on how people navigate their careers, there is a tendency for historically men to have networks that allow them to advance in positions that were never posted. And what I do like about some of these tools is that it's leveling the internal playing field. I mean, there still may be that whole tendency, but at least you now know that, hey, there's an open position at this level and here are the skills that are required. So I do like that aspect on the development side, but I share some of the concerns on the hiring side and many of the things, Alita, that you mentioned.
Could I just add something? It's the idea of listing specific skills, because it's like market share when you're looking at antitrust. It's how you define skills. And in order to, I guess, bring different ways of thinking or people with different kinds of experience that would work in a position, even if they're not identified as a job requirement, requires a much broader way of thinking. And so a lot of it are the people that bring in the technology, but some of it is how things are looked at. And just because you can doesn't mean you should. And saving money is so significant to businesses that, given the opportunity to use technology to save money, when I see those robots in supermarkets that are supposed to monitor what's on shelves or clean floors or something, I ask the managers if people have lost their jobs for those things, because it's an unskilled position, and they look for ways to save money. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, I suppose. Thank you, everyone, for your answers, and I will stop here.
Thanks, Alita. Rita Popper.
This has been wonderful, absolutely wonderful. You have made me think about things. The minute I heard AI, I thought of robotics, and now I learned that there is a difference. My one question is, when you are evaluating someone, who put the questions in? How do you know that the questions were good enough to give you the best person? Do you do that just one time, or do you do it like when somebody applies for a job, they sometimes interview with 3 and 4 people in a company, and then they sit around and discuss that person? You don't have that ability with AI. And we are in a changing world, and every time we think of the Industrial Revolution, I think of AI as a new revolution. We're in a new revolution. We're at the beginning. How can AI make some people who are not working, retirees, how will it affect their lives?
Panelists, would anybody like to respond?
I think I can respond maybe to the latter half of what you were asking. I think the first half, it might be maybe more in John and Julia's wheelhouse. And this is also going to be a little bit of a response to something that Alita brought up. So one of the things I've been most excited about when I see the these are sort of systematic academic studies that have been done of the use of different types of generative AI, is it looks like when individuals are given these tools for a given task, that they're able to accomplish that task much more quickly and more productively than they were before. And I'll give you a specific example in just a moment. And in particular, it seems like it's the less experienced folks that gain the most, that see the biggest improvement. So I'll give you one example. One generative AI tool is called Copilot. So GitHub is a software repository where a lot of people have put software code. They have used that code to create something called Copilot. And so for those of you that use Gmail, and maybe when you start typing out your email, there's predictive typing. It suggests what you might want to do to complete the sentence. So it's something similar to that, but for coding. So you start coding and you get suggestions for what the rest of the code might look like. And so research shows that when folks use this tool to code, they code faster, more accurately, et cetera. Their productivity goes up. But again, it's the least experienced coders that experience the biggest gain from this tool. And so that suggests that, at least in some instances, these tools can be used to train or retrain people pretty quickly and would be effective at training or retraining folks that maybe don't have as much of a base to start from. And so that could be a retiree, for example.
Thank you.
Could I just add one point here, which is that predictive typing is one of the things I really dislike about Gmail. And it's not because I have any particular problem with it, but it's the question about the impacts on the commons versus the individuals. So here we have a great example of something that could be really good for individuals, as Professor Siemens just said, but to take that, and we might all like not having to do all that extra typing, but here's an example of a situation where all of that AI generated communication might really degrade our linguistic skills as a community. And I think it's really important for us to think about impacts both on individuals, but also, if we want to call it the commons or the community or the social impacts, we think about those in terms of the market failures and all of the ways in which individual behavior, which might be rational for those individuals, might end up being suboptimal for society as a whole.
Thank you.
Lori? You have to unmute. Good.
I've unmuted. Hello, thank you. This was a wonderful panel. And I have a question for Dr. Shore. Dr. Shore, I've been familiar with your work for many, many years, too many years to name, because I interviewed you once in the 1990s about your book, The Overworked American. And I was working for GMA at the time. And so I am a member of the Writers Guild of America, who've been in the news lately. And my question for you is, capitalism being what it is, isn't when employers save time and effort for their employees, don't they have a tendency to then compile, rather than giving them time off, compound the work? So it's like, so for instance, like I've had jobs over the years that required certain tasks, and then as the years went on, there were just more and more tasks. You know, you had to do more things for the same job, you know, and the same, because some of it was efficiencies. But I mean, could you talk a little bit about like what the impetus is for the employer to give the benefit to the employee as opposed to, you know, just making more money?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it is really relevant to the whole discussion that we've been having, which is when technologies are introduced in capitalist economies or market economies, whatever term people prefer, the way they get deployed, the impacts that they have and so forth it's not inherent in the technology. It's not something that you know absolutely in advance what's going to happen, because a lot of it depends on the state of play of the labor market and relations between workers and their employers. So if thinking about that, you know, I wrote that book and it came out in 1992. And then we went into a period, you know, of that's been really terrible for working people. If you look at wages, you look at income inequality, you look at big excess labor supply globally, and decreases in unionization and all of those things, which really weaken the bargaining power of workers relative to their employers. And of course, you know, many people have argued and done a lot of good work on the role of technology in those changes. So a lot depends on the moment in which these changes happen. We're in a very different moment right now. You know, as you know, first of all, from the strike, which was settled yesterday, from the strikes which are ongoing, from the Great Resignation, from unfilled positions, from the unwillingness of elites to kind of really, you know, jack up interest rates and tank the economy and sort of reduce workers' bargaining power in the way that has happened in the past. So I think a lot of it really depends on the state of play between workers and employers. And my feeling is, for a variety of reasons, unless there's some really big changes, we're not likely to see that kind of reversion to those sort of difficult years for workers that went over a number of decades. We're not likely to see that right away. That's why I'm a little bit sanguine about the work time reduction, because I think it's something that sort of goes with the state of the labor market right now. So a lot just depends on those power dynamics in the market.
From your lips to God's ear. Thank you very much.
Abraham?
Hi, thank you very much. Really great presentations. Really, thank you for putting this together. I think my greatest concern with AI and all it brings is, you know, while I recognize that it will create opportunity for new jobs while replacing others, you know, I think some of the risk that I see is that it's an opportunity to increase with the already existing digital divide, where those who do not have access to technology, which AI is, and some of the new jobs that will be created by AI will be heading in the more technological space and replacing more manual, repeatable jobs, then those individuals and communities that are on the wrong side of the digital divide will only be further and further separated from opportunities for, you know, new types of emerging jobs. So I think that's one of the things that, you know, I think society and governments need to think about, is how to go about, you know, helping bridge that digital divide. And particularly, you know, recent stats in New York City alone, almost 25% of households lacked, you know, broadband subscriptions at home. So if we're not coming up with solutions to provide for the populations that are on that wrong side of the digital divide, it's just going to create more unequal access and lack of opportunity for jobs, even if more are created with AI. And I recognize there's an opportunity for skill development and growth, but the premise is that you have access to that technology to begin with, which I think a lot of populations don't. So just not a question, but just food for thought.
Unless any panelists would like to speak to this a little bit. If
I'd
not,
like to actually
go
very
ahead,
quickly
Julia.
comment
Sure.
on this. I absolutely agree with your thoughtful comments, and I would add to this that people who will be particularly derailed in terms of their careers and in terms of their lives are those who are unable to see through the nonsense that AI sometimes produces. So we actually need to build those critical thinking skills and the skepticism very carefully. There's a lot of magical thinking in the population, and a lot of that is deliberately supported by those who have a financial interest in selling tools to us and therefore having economic power that don't really do anything other than make money for those who sell them. So this needs to develop critical thinking. I think it's just crucial.
Thank you. Rita, you had another question?
Did the pandemic, which changed how people went to work and didn't go to work, how they live at home, how businesses that thrived on business, like places where people went for lunch, and now those places don't exist, has the pandemic skewed any of your calculations? And do you see a need for, are you able to predict what could happen or what should happen as a result of things sort of turning back to normal, but not exactly?
Any thoughts? Well, if not, it's something.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
Dr. Shore has a thought.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I didn't see that. Dr. Shore, sorry. Saida, it looks like Dr. Shore, for some reason, has been muted. Could you please unmute her?
Now I can.
Thank you.
Now I can unmute. Thanks. Well, I can say that for work time reduction, the pandemic changed everything. I mean, Lori mentioned, I wrote a book in 1992 about this, and I was banging my head against the wall. And, sort of in the years just right before the pandemic, there really started to be, a group of people trying to get somewhere on work time reduction and the 4-day week more generally. And it was just a handful of companies. And the pandemic dramatically transformed the way employers thought about this issue. And it has to do mostly, at least what they're saying, many of them has to do with the shift to remote work, because it led them to do two things. One is trust their employees a lot more. And the other is just be open to the idea that things could change and that they would be all right. So it really changed the inertia of the status quo. So to me, it's been a real silver lining. I know there's a lot of conflict now about return to office and so forth, but it propelled this movement in a way that was, I just don't think would have happened without the pandemic.
Thank you.
I'd like to just ask whoever could answer this. So is there something employees can do if they're worried about the fact that their job could be eliminated by AI? Are there steps they could take, or what would someone suggest?
I have two suggestions. And I also wanted to react to the previous question about prediction. So I personally am not in the business of predicting. I'm in the business of trying to engineer. Right. So I think that we all actually have an opportunity to make society what we want it to be. and make ourselves what we want ourselves to be. And that's an engineer speaking here. So employees and people generally, I think, should educate themselves on AI. And I'm really thrilled to see so many of you here today and asking these really thoughtful questions. So, make an effort to learn more about these topics. And the other thing that we should all do is advocate for better, stronger legal and regulatory guardrails. We need laws to help us deal with labor issues, to help us deal with the proliferation of less than thoughtful AI practices in society. And it's up to all of us to speak up and to push our elected officials in the right direction.
If I could just add, I want to add both to Julia's comment and to Juliet's comment from before. So I completely agree with the suggestion, right? I think that step number one is start to educate oneself on this. And I wouldn't suggest educating oneself by trying to read popular press articles. I think that that's a mistake. There's a real agenda that's being pushed there around scare stories. There's plenty to be worried about, but I think it's sort of not helpful to start there. I don't work for OpenAI, but I would suggest that folks get a ChatGPT account and start playing around with it, right? It's free to use. It'll give you a sense of what it is that this technology can do and also what it does pretty poorly. And I think it's just useful just to start familiarizing yourself with that technology. So that was the comment to the most recent question. I wanted just to come back to something around, let's call it sort of like institutional differences. Professor Shore has been talking about maybe institutional differences across time, and I totally agree with the thesis that we're in a very different time right now than we were 20, 50, maybe 100 years ago. And I also therefore agree that the way in which this technology will affect our economy and our society, it means that we have to take into consideration the context against which the technology is being commercialized. So I agree with that. In addition, you can also think about differences across areas. So it could be areas in the US, or it could be differences across countries. And so I wanted to just sort of leave you with this final thought. So this is about robots. So Rita, I think you'll be happy because you asked briefly about robots instead of AI. So research that's been done on robots and the anxiety that it turns out that Americans have a lot of anxiety about the effect of robots on their jobs. Okay. However, it turns out that if you do sort of a similar type of study, say in Germany, you don't see that same level of anxiety about a robot taking a job. Why? Well, because the social safety net, let's say, or maybe the relationship between firms and workers is different in Germany than it is in the US. So again, I think it points to the fact that these institutional factors, and again, I think Professor Shore was also talking about some of these. So for example, relationships with unions and things like that. These really do matter and will shape the ways in which the technology will get commercialized, adopted, and used.
Are there any other questions for our panelist? Peggy?
Alita.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Alita, I didn't see you.
No, that's okay. I think Professor Siemens had raised something, which is that Europe is taking the potential disruption in a negative way of AI much more seriously than we are. And it's not just Germany. I understand that France also, or the EU in general, and I'm wondering why and what that means. And there seems to just be, this is just a comment really, such a rush in this country to embrace any form of technology that saves money, that AI is just moving forward in such a fast pace, and sometimes without thinking, that in Iowa, at the Iowa State Fair last year, a painting painted by one of those AI programs where you feed a line of text into it and it creates a painting, won a prize. So not anything to do with a person. And there was a lot of controversy over that where are we going to get the kinds of guardrails that that Professor Stojanovic had, I'm sorry about the name, had raised, when there is probably so much pressure, and we've seen how large companies work in terms of lobbying and pressure on legislators. How are we going to get something that actually protects workers or the population at large, and protect us not just from the big things, but from what someone else had referred to as maybe improvements for individuals, but as a detriment to society or the community in general.
Yeah, it's up to us. I mean, there's no other way to put it, really. We do need to fight for this. Yeah.
I noticed that Professor Hausknet has been muted for a little while. I would actually love to get him to weigh in on this particular point, because Professor Stojanovic, and I apologize, Julia, for
Julia is fine. Yeah.
had this great quote. Well, some might think it great, in the New York Times. This might have been 4 months ago or so, saying we might get the regulation wrong, but we got to get the regulation out there, because it's only by getting it out there that we'll see what works and what doesn't work. That sounds to run counter to a comment that John had earlier about waiting to put regulation in place until we know more. And so to me, it feels like those are at odds with each other, but it might, if we could hear them weigh in on that, Alita, it might address your point.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think I actually agree with Julia. I think getting something out there is good, because without something, how do you start? How do you get the conversation going? My thought is that it is a complicated issue right now. Even agreeing to the definition of what we're talking about was a battle, and I think it's still not a definition that people agree on or necessarily all embrace. So that's what I mean by waiting, because I'm not sure that people, if we define algorithms strictly, let's say, I'm not sure people would agree with the consequences of that strict of a definition once they see what it means, right? You can't use Excel to sort names or something. That's a silly example, but you know, that stuff matters, and I don't think it's sorted out yet, but I do agree getting something out there is good, because otherwise, how do we correct, adjust, update? Julia, what do you think?
Disappointing. It's always good to have a disagreement on a panel, and we don't seem to have one. But yeah, the definitions are really, really hard. And I mean, this is not just AI, right? So as a computer scientist, I remember when there were these panels and workshops and conferences where, you know, wise people would get together and try to define what is computer science. And yet the field blossomed without there being a definition that everybody agrees on. So it's one of these things where you know it when you see it. But I think for AI specifically, it's very important to not focus just on the technology, right? It's not the calculator. It's the technology together with data, together with the context of use, and in this case, together with the fact that we use this technology to make decisions on our behalf or assist people in making decisions, right? So this is what we worry about. There are also other types of AI, like, you know, those that we use in astronomy to help us map out the sky better. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about decision making, right, with the help of algorithms. Yeah, there was another thing I wanted to say, and I think it's actually going to be a nice thing to close with for me, because I'm going to need to drop off. And that is, if you were looking for a job that is safe, comedian is always going to be safe, right? Because AI has no sense of humor. You can try to get jokes out of ChatGPT. They're terrible.
Should I ask one more question? And I don't know if anyone knows this, but one of the issues for the writers and also the actors in part was the effect of AI on their jobs. Does anyone know what the resolution was in terms of the settlement on that particular issue? And maybe Lori does as a member of the WGA.
Don't know.
Aida,
personally.
can you unmute Lori?
Yes, you are unmuted.
I did unmute her. She might be away from her computer.
No, I'm right here. Here I am. Yeah, well, there were two things. I mean, I know that for the writers, they got what did I read? They got the AI, that they will not be asked, I'm paraphrasing, but my understanding of it is that they got that they will not have to work on scripts that were generated by AI. So in other words, they will not have to, pick up and write a script that was created from an AI. So that's good. The problem for the actors, as I understand it, is that I heard a story. There was a story in the Times about a woman who had gone in, an actress who had gone in and had her picture, had got 1 day's pay, and all they did was take her picture from like every angle on God's green earth. And she realized this was before they went on strike, but she realized when she left that 1 day of employment that she had really given away the image of her body. So she could be put into, for instance, all kinds of crowd scenes, if there was a parade, if they wanted to do a concert, like there were just myriad opportunities for them to use, this 1 day's work for, in perpetuity. So that was really scary. And I do not know where they are with their negotiations on that. So I don't know that part of it, but I mean, for this, the writers did very well. And if the studios, want to settle this strike with the actors, which we all hope that they do, they'll follow the same, line of thinking, but we don't know, and I know that one thing that I read was the writers brought up the AI thing in the beginning, and the producers didn't want to deal with it. They said, it's too early. We don't know what the technology is going to mean for us, so we're not going to deal with it. And now, after the strike and after the settlement and everything, they've said that that was a mistake, that they should have dealt with it when they, when the writers brought it up. So hopefully they'll do something proactive with the actors.
The example that you gave, though, Lori, and maybe this is just my last thing for the panel, is an example of perhaps why the optimism of the panel on the lack of impact on jobs is maybe misplaced. Because if they're taking an actor that they normally would pay residuals for, or a daily rate, and I used to work in the film business, to show up and say some lines, or even just be in a crowd scene as an extra, and now they don't have to do it because they're buying they're paying some minimal amount for their face, is why every other company in this country that is looking to save money by using AI is going to do it. And is not, and that's a creative enterprise. Filmmaking is creative. It's not just producing widgets or something that just runs a factory. I mean, there's creativity in everything, but not to the extent of some in the entertainment or the arts or the sports fields. And so I'm very, and I certainly know a mere tiny fraction of what the panel does, but frankly, it really frightens me, the idea that companies enabled to just save money at great expense, not just for individuals, but for society at large, by diminishing the value of their workforce, will do that. And I don't know how to get legislation out there. I don't know, and maybe Gail and Peggy do, where our state or city legislators, I guess the city in terms of hiring, but it's not broad enough, in the state and the federal government. And without that legislation, and if we're trailing behind, we're just really going to lose. So I'm going to end by saying I'm very pessimistic and concerned. So it's not my panel, and I'm not on the panel. And so thank you all for listening to me express all of this concern. So thank you.
Thank you to our panelists. You certainly have given us a lot to think about. And what I personally appreciate is your different perspectives. I think that overall your comments are quite enlightening, and things that we really should delve into and start to become more familiar with. And we really appreciate your joining us, spending as much time as you have. And Peggy now, I think, has a word or two she'd like to say.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gail. Professor Siemens had something he wanted to say a minute ago.
No, sorry, maybe I did something with
Oh,
my
yeah.
phone.
Oh, sorry.
No, I sorry about that.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Thank
And
you very much. It has been excellent and very informative. Really appreciate your time and all your insights that are so invaluable to our
and we
community.
hope we can call you back in the future as things keep evolving so that we can continue to have a better understanding of where AI is really going and how it's going to impact us. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
And thanks to all of you who tuned in tonight. Very good to see you all, and thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.